You have 24 hours, every single one of them. No more, no less. The same number that was handed to the richest person on earth this morning. The same number given to the person who changed history, wrote the book, built the company, found the love, became the person they always dreamed of being. 24 hours. And yet, most of us reach the end of most days with the feeling that we somehow missed the whole thing, like life happened in a room next door and we were just standing in the hallway waiting to be let in. Arnold Bennett, writing over 100 years ago, saw this. He saw it with the clarity of someone who had climbed out of poverty, taught himself everything worth knowing, and refused to let a single day pass without wringing something real and lasting from it. And what he wrote, in a book that still feels like it was written for this exact moment in your life, was not a self-help manual full of tips and tricks. It was something rarer. It was an honest conversation between one human being and another about what it actually means to be alive and to live, rather than simply to exist. This is not a book about success in the conventional sense. Bennett is not trying to make you rich, though understanding his ideas might quietly help with that. He is not trying to make you famous or thin or admired at dinner parties. He is trying to do something that almost no one in the history of advice-giving has had the honesty or the courage to actually attempt. He is trying to wake you up, not in some dramatic, shout-from-the-rooftops way, but in the way that a good friend might sit across from you at a table, look you in the eye, and say something that rearranges the furniture inside your mind. The world Bennett was writing in was different from ours in 100 visible ways. No internet, no smartphones, no streaming services competing for every fragment of your attention. But the internal landscape he was describing, the fog of half-lived days, the vague dissatisfaction that hums underneath ordinary life, the sense that you are always preparing to start living rather than actually living, that landscape has not changed at all. If anything, it has become more crowded, more insistent, more difficult to escape, which is why this book, more than a century after it was first published, still lands with the weight of something urgent and true. Think for a moment about a man named Thomas. He is 38 years old. He gets up in the morning and commutes to a job that pays his bills and occasionally interests him. He comes home tired. He eats dinner with his family, but he is only half there, the other half of him already anticipating the couch, the television, the blessed numbness of an evening with nothing demanded of him. He goes to bed, he wakes up, he does it again on weekends. He feels a restlessness he cannot quite name. He tells himself he will start the thing he has always wanted to do, learn an instrument, read the books stacked on his nightstand, go on that trip, have that real conversation with his father before it is too late. He tells himself he will start when things settle down, when work gets easier, when the children are older, when he feels more ready. Thomas is not unhappy, exactly, but he is not really living either. He is waiting for his life to begin, not realizing that it already began, that it has been going on this whole time, and that it is quietly, steadily, without drama or announcement, being used up. Arnold Bennett wrote How to Live for Thomas. He wrote it for all of us who are, to some degree, Thomas. And what he said, stripped of all the Victorian politeness and the charming English indirectness, was this: You are wasting the most extraordinary thing you have ever been given. And the worst part is, you do not even know it. And the best part, the genuinely, heart-lifting best part, is that you can stop, not tomorrow, not when things settle down. You can stop and choose differently, beginning from the very next hour you live. Let us start where Bennett starts, which is with a question so simple it almost seems too obvious to ask. What is it that you actually want from your days? Not from your life in the grand abstract sense, not the tombstone summary, not the thing you would say at a job interview, but from your actual days, the ones that are happening right now, the Tuesday afternoons and the Wednesday mornings and the Saturdays that seem to evaporate before you have done anything worth remembering. What do you want those to feel like? Most people have never seriously asked themselves this question. They have preferences and habits and routines, but they have never sat down and genuinely interrogated what they are hoping for from the experience of being alive on an ordinary day. Bennett considered this neglect to be one of the great tragedies of modern existence. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the answer, once you stopped to find it, turned out to be surprisingly achievable, and yet most people never even tried. He noticed something that is still almost universally true today. People divide their lives into two unequal halves. There is the time they must give to work, which they tend to treat as the real business of life, the thing that counts, the machinery that keeps everything running. And then there is the remaining time, the hours before and after and around the edges of work, which they tend to treat as a kind of leftover. Leisure, rest, recovery, the part that is not really meant to accomplish anything. And Bennett's response to this division was both gentle and devastating. He said, "The time you give to your employer is your employer's time, and you are compensated for it. But the time outside of work, that is yours. That is entirely, completely, irreducibly yours. And most people treat the most important asset they possess as though it were a leftover, a remainder, a thing to be consumed rather than invested." He was not suggesting that rest is bad. He loved rest. He understood exhaustion. He was not one of those relentlessly productive types who make other people feel guilty for ever sitting still. What he was pointing at was something more specific and more interesting. He was pointing at the difference between genuine rest, which restores you, which fills you back up, which leaves you feeling more like yourself, and the kind of passive, half-conscious consumption of hours that passes for leisure in most people's lives, but that actually leaves you more depleted than before. The difference between reading a novel that absorbs you completely and staring at nothing in particular for 2 hours. The difference between a walk where you actually notice the world around you and the same route walked while your mind churns anxiously over the same concerns it always churns over. The difference between a real conversation and two people talking past each other while checking their phones. One of these is rest. The other is just lost time wearing the costume of rest. Now, the question that most people ask when they hear this kind of talk is, "But what should I do with my time?" And Bennett, bless him, did not answer this question by giving a list. He did not say exercise more, or read the classics, or learn a foreign language, or meditate, though he had opinions about all of these things. What he said first, before any of that, was something that sounds obvious but is not. He said, "You need to think, not worry, not ruminate, not scroll through possibilities in a state of low-grade anxiety. Think, deliberately, consciously, with your full attention brought to bear on the question of what kind of person you want to be and what kind of life you actually want to live. There is a story about a woman, a doctor, who worked brutal hours in a hospital in a big city. She saved lives. She was genuinely good at her job. But she had this recurring feeling, this shadow that followed her home each evening, that her own life was somehow passing her by while she was busy helping everyone else. She had not read a novel in 2 years. She had not had a conversation with a friend that lasted longer than 15 minutes in, she could not remember how long. She exercised because she knew she should, but she had stopped feeling the pleasure of movement. She was, in the truest sense of the word, going through the motions. Then someone gave her a battered old copy of Bennett's book, and the thing that cracked something open in her was not advice about habits or schedules. It was a single paragraph in which Bennett observed that the vast majority of people have never once stopped to decide what they actually believe, what they actually value, what they actually want. They have inherited their opinions absorbed their habits, stumbled into their priorities, and then spent their entire lives as strangers to themselves, wondering vaguely why something important seems to be missing. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she closed the book and sat with it, and she began, for the first time in years, to actually think. What did she discover? We will come back to her, because her story illustrates something that runs through every page of Bennett's book, which is that the revolution he is proposing is not external. He is not asking you to change your job or your city or your relationships, though all of those things might change as a consequence of what he is proposing. He is asking you to change your relationship to your own mind, to actually inhabit the life you have, rather than drifting through it on autopilot while some imagined future life waits just around a corner that never quite arrives. The mind, Bennett argued, is the most extraordinary instrument any of us will ever possess. Not the brain in the strictly biological sense, but the mind, the capacity for thought, for attention, for genuine engagement with ideas and experiences and other people. And most of us use it the way a concert pianist might use a Steinway grand piano to occasionally bang out a rough version of a song they half remember from childhood. The instrument is capable of so much more than we ask of it, not because we are lazy exactly, but because we have never been taught to ask more of it. We have been trained to use our minds to solve problems at work, to navigate social situations, to manage logistics, to process the endless stream of information that the modern world pours over us. We have not been taught to use our minds to actually think about life, to engage seriously with ideas, to develop what Bennett called the mental habit of genuine attention. He had a particular affection for philosophy, not the academic kind that lives in dusty journals and speaks a language only specialists can decode, but the original kind, the kind that asks the questions that matter most. Why are we here? How should we live? What makes a human life well spent? He believed that every person, not just scholars, not just intellectuals, not just the highly educated, every person had the capacity and, he would have said, the responsibility to wrestle with these questions. Not to arrive at certain answers necessarily, but to take the questions seriously, to live examined, to be, in some meaningful sense, the author of your own values rather than the passive recipient of whatever your culture happened to hand you. This is connected to something Bennett felt very strongly about, which was the question of reading. Not reading as a social performance or a status marker, not the kind of reading where you carry a certain book in a certain way to signal something about the kind of person you are, but reading as a genuine act of encounter. The encounter between your mind and another mind, across time and distance and all the accidents of history that might have prevented either mind from existing. He believed that a person who read widely, who read with genuine curiosity and attention, was a fundamentally different kind of person from one who did not. Not better, in any simple moral sense, but richer, more furnished on the inside, more capable of understanding themselves and others, more alive to the texture of experience. He observed, with a kind of affectionate exasperation, that most people spent very little of their free time reading anything that genuinely challenged them. They read newspapers, which inform them about events, but rarely help them understand the world. They read popular fiction, which sometimes delighted them, but rarely nourished them at the level he was pointing at. They read what was easy, and he was not opposed to easy reading. He wrote popular novels himself successfully, and he knew the pleasure of a story that carries you along without effort. But he wanted people to also have the experience of reading something that resisted them, something that required them to slow down, to reread a passage, to close the book and sit with an idea before moving on. Not because difficulty was inherently virtuous, but because the kind of growth that happens in that slowing down, that engagement with resistance, is a kind that does not happen any other way. Here is where the story of the doctor becomes relevant again. When she stopped to actually think, one of the things she thought about was reading. She had loved books as a child, had been the kind of reader who disappeared into libraries and came out hours later, blinking in the light like someone returning from a long journey. But somewhere in the relentless machinery of medical school and residency and the early years of her career, reading had become something she promised herself she would do when she had time, which meant it had quietly stopped happening. She decided, after reading Bennett, to reclaim 30 minutes a night. Just 30. Not an hour, not 2 hours. 30 minutes before sleep, with a real book, a book that asked something of her. Within 3 months she had read 6 books. Within 6 months she was having conversations she had not had in years, because her mind was full of things to think about and say. Within a year she told a friend that she felt like herself again, like she had been away somewhere and had come back. Not because 30 minutes a night had solved her problems, but because it had re-established her relationship with her own mind. She had started treating herself as a person worth thinking about, rather than just a function to be performed. This is what Bennett was pointing at. Not productivity, not self-improvement in the self-congratulatory sense that can make self-help so exhausting. Something quieter and more fundamental. The restoration of a relationship with yourself. The recovery of the sense that you are a person with an inner life worth cultivating, not just a role to be played or a function to be performed. He was also, it should be said, tremendously practical. He was not a dreamer or an idealist in the sense of someone who floats above the actual conditions of ordinary life. He had grown up with very little, in a household where money was always tight, where practicality was not a virtue but a survival skill. So when he talked about using your time well, he was not imagining some life of leisured contemplation available only to people of independent means. He was imagining the life of someone exactly like himself, or like the clerk in his local bank, or the woman who worked in the shop on the corner, someone with real obligations and real limitations and real fatigue at the end of a real working day. He was imagining your life, and what he said to that person, to you, was, even within the constraints of your actual life, there is more room than you think. More room to think, to read, to develop your mind, to live with intention rather than just inertia, but you have to choose to use it. It will not happen by accident. The morning, he believed, was sacred, not in any religious sense, though he was not dismissive of religion, but in the practical sense that the hours before the working day began belonged to you in a way that the hours after work often did not. After work, you were tired. After work, there were demands and distractions and the accumulated weight of everything the day had taken from you. After work, there were demands and distractions and the accumulated weight of everything the day had taken from you, but the morning, especially if you rose even 30 minutes earlier than you had to, offered something different. A stillness, a sense of time not yet claimed by anyone or anything. He wrote about the particular quality of early morning consciousness, the way the mind can be both rested and alert in those first waking hours before the day's anxieties have fully assembled themselves. He saw this as an opportunity that most people were quite literally sleeping through. Now, this is not a sermon about waking up at 5 in the morning. Bennett was not that kind of writer. He was too honest about human nature to pretend that everyone was suited to the same rhythm. What he was pointing at was the principle behind the practice, that if you wait for time to appear, it will not appear. That if you want hours that belong to you, you have to actively reclaim them from the natural tendency of life to fill every available space with obligation and distraction. Whether you do that in the morning or in a lunch hour or in the evenings after the children are asleep matters less than whether you do it at all. The question is not when. The question is whether you will decide that your inner life is worth protecting time for, whether you will decide that you matter enough to be treated, by yourself, as someone worth investing in. And this idea of treating yourself as an investment rather than just a resource to be depleted runs very deep in Bennett's thinking. He noticed something that we would now call burnout, though he did not use that word. He noticed that people who gave everything to their work and nothing to their inner development tended to arrive at a certain age with a kind of hollowness that no amount of professional success could fill. They had sacrificed the person on the altar of the career. They had traded the richness of an examined, cultivated inner life for the external markers of achievement, and then discovered, often too late, that the markers were not the thing. The thing was the life inside. The thing was the capacity to be genuinely present to your own experience, to find genuine meaning in the small textures of ordinary days, to be, in the deepest sense, awake. Let us talk about attention, because attention is really at the heart of everything Bennett was writing about. We live in a world that is at war with our attention. Not metaphorically, genuinely, structurally at war with it. Every platform, every notification, every cleverly designed interface is optimizing for the capture and retention of your attention because your attention is the product being sold. This was not true in Bennett's world in the same way, but the underlying problem he identified was the same. The problem of a mind that skitters across the surface of experience rather than sinking into it. The problem of passing through your days without actually seeing them, without actually tasting them, without actually being there. He told his readers to practice attention the way a musician practices scales, deliberately, regularly, with the understanding that it was a skill that could be developed, not just a natural endowment that some people had and others did not. He suggested exercises as simple as choosing one thing in your ordinary environment, a tree in the street, the quality of light at a particular time of day, the expression on a stranger's face, and really looking at it, not glancing at it, really looking, bringing your full unhurried attention to the thing in front of you and staying there in that act of looking long enough for something to happen, long enough for the thing to become interesting in a way it was not when you glanced at it, long enough for your mind to make some small discovery. This sounds easy. It is not easy. Try it. Try to look at something, anything, with complete, uninterrupted attention for 5 minutes. You will discover that your mind has an almost desperate need to move, to slide away, to think about something else, to check whether there is something more urgent or more interesting or more pressing that needs your attention right now. The mind resists stillness the way water resists being poured upward. And Bennett knew this. He was not asking for the impossible, he was asking for practice. The same patient, systematic practice that transforms a beginner into a musician, a novice into a master of anything. The same practice of returning and returning and returning again each time the mind wanders to the thing you are actually trying to pay attention to. Because what happens when you develop this capacity, when you genuinely develop the ability to be fully present to your own experience, is that everything changes. Not the external circumstances of your life, not your job or your bank account or your body. The experience of being alive changes. The same walk you have taken 100 times becomes, when you actually pay attention to it, something worth taking. The same meal becomes, when you actually taste it, a genuine pleasure. The same conversation becomes, when you actually listen, a source of real connection. Nothing external has changed. Everything internal has. This is what Bennett meant when he said that a person who had developed genuine attention was living a fundamentally richer life than one who had not, regardless of what either person owned or achieved or experienced in the conventional sense. He was also wonderfully pragmatic about what this development required. It did not require a retreat from the world. It did not require silence or solitude or any particular lifestyle. It could be practiced in a crowded train or a busy office or a kitchen full of children and noise. The practice was always the same. Whatever you are doing, try to actually do it. Try to actually be there while you are there. Try to inhabit the moment you are in, rather than mentally rehearsing the next one or revisiting the last one. This is, as anyone who has tried it knows, a lifelong project rather than a thing you achieve and then possess. But the fact that it is lifelong does not make it less valuable. It makes it more so, because every moment of genuine attention is a moment of genuine living, and they accumulate, these moments, into a life that feels, at the end, like it was actually yours. Near the 10-minute mark of understanding this book, you start to feel something shift. You start to realize that Bennett is not talking about becoming a different person. He is talking about becoming more fully the person you already are. This is not a small distinction. So much of what passes for self-improvement is really self-replacement, the anxious effort to discard who you are and substitute something better, thinner, more productive, more admired, more worthy of the life you are supposed to be living. Bennett had no patience for this. He thought it was both dishonest and counterproductive. He thought the project was not to become someone else, but to become more genuinely yourself, to develop the capacities that were already there in seed form, waiting for the water of attention and intention to bring them to life. If you are enjoying this exploration of Bennett's ideas, please like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means more content like this, more of these deep dives into the books that have quietly changed lives for generations, can keep coming. We have a lot more to explore together, so stay with us. Now, one of the things that makes How to Live so enduringly interesting is that Bennett took pleasure seriously. Not as a reward for hard work, not as a guilty indulgence to be rationed carefully, but as a genuine component of a well-lived life. He believed that beauty was important, that delight was important, that the capacity to be genuinely pleased by something, a piece of music, a good meal, a sunset, a passage in a book, a conversation that surprises you with its warmth, was not a luxury but a necessity. And he was concerned, in a way that feels very modern, that the pace and pressure of ordinary life were eroding this capacity in people, that people were becoming less and less capable of genuine pleasure, not because they had less to be pleased about, but because they had less and less of the internal stillness that genuine pleasure requires. You cannot enjoy music if you are anxious. You cannot enjoy food if you are eating it while doing something else. You cannot enjoy the company of another person if half of your attention is somewhere else. Pleasure, real pleasure, requires presence. It requires showing up. And so the cultivation of genuine pleasure is not separate from the cultivation of attention. It is the same project, seen from a different angle. When Bennett urged his readers to read more, to engage with the arts, to develop tastes and enthusiasms and genuine passions, he was not being a cultural snob. He was making a practical argument about the quality of daily life. A person with genuine passions, things they are authentically, deeply interested in, is a person who has built into their ordinary life a reliable source of pleasure and meaning. They do not need special circumstances to be happy. They do not need everything to go right. They have something inside them that generates its own light. Think about the people in your own life who seem most alive. Not the most successful, necessarily, or the most admired, but the most genuinely alive, the ones whose presence energizes rather than drains, the ones who seem to be actually living rather than just marking time. Almost without exception, these people have something they care about deeply. Some enthusiasm that is authentically theirs, not borrowed from what they think they should care about, but something that actually moves them, actually interests them, actually matters to them. And the interesting thing is that it almost does not matter what the thing is. It can be birds or jazz, or the history of ancient civilizations, or the cultivation of tomatoes. What matters is that it is real. What matters is that it provides a genuine connection between the person and the world, a thread of authentic interest that runs through their days and gives those days a kind of texture and meaning that purely instrumental living cannot provide. Bennett wrote about this in terms of what he called mental interest, and he argued that it was one of the most important things a person could cultivate. Not as a hobby in the trivial sense, not as something to mention at dinner parties, but as a genuine commitment to developing and deepening your engagement with something you find genuinely interesting. He thought that most people underestimated how much of their unhappiness was really just boredom. Not boredom in the sense of having nothing to do. Most people had plenty to do. Boredom in the deeper sense of having nothing that genuinely interested them, nothing they were pursuing for its own sake rather than for some external payoff. Nothing they could get lost in, nothing that made them forget occasionally to check the time. And he was optimistic, genuinely, practically optimistic, about people's capacity to develop these interests if they would only try. He did not believe that some people were interesting and others were not, that some people had the capacity for enthusiasm and others were constitutionally incapable of it. He believed that the capacity for genuine interest was universal and that it had been suppressed in most people by a combination of habit, circumstance, and the simple failure to ever try anything new with genuine attention and commitment. He had seen too many people discover, in middle age or even later, passions that transformed their lives to believe otherwise. He knew a man of 50 who had never read anything but newspapers until a friend lent him a volume of Shakespeare, and who became, within a year, someone whose knowledge of and passion for literature made him remarkable in any company. He knew women who had lived in the same city their whole lives without ever really seeing it, who discovered, when they began to actually look, that they were living in a place of extraordinary beauty and interest. He knew people who had said all their lives that they had no appreciation for music, who discovered, when they actually listened, that music could move them to their foundations. What he was pointing at was the difference between exposing yourself to something and actually trying to engage with it. We pass through museums and concerts and natural landscapes and bookshops, and we absorb very little, because we are not really trying to engage. We are performing engagement, or we are simply present, which is not the same thing. Real engagement requires effort. It requires the willingness to feel confused or ignorant or overwhelmed and to stay there anyway, past the discomfort, until something opens up, until the thing that seemed foreign becomes gradually familiar, until the effort yields something genuine. This is something Bennett had thought about very carefully, partly because he had done it himself so many times. He had been a largely self-educated man who had made himself into one of the best-read and most cultivated people of his generation, not by some natural gift for learning, but by the systematic application of genuine effort over many years. He knew what it felt like to struggle with something difficult and to push through the struggle until the difficulty became pleasure. He knew that this transformation, from struggling with something to finding genuine pleasure in it, was available to virtually anyone who was willing to go through the necessary initial discomfort. And he thought it was one of the best things a human being could do for themselves, not because being well-read or culturally sophisticated was inherently superior to not being those things, but because the process of genuine learning, the actual experience of a mind being expanded, was one of the most satisfying experiences available to human beings, and was available to everyone. Let us take a moment to talk about something that runs underneath all of this, something Bennett talked about with unusual directness for a Victorian gentleman: the relationship between how you live and how you feel. Not in the therapeutic sense, not in the sense of mental health as it would be discussed today, but in the simpler, more direct sense that the quality of your daily habits has a profound effect on the quality of your inner life. If you spend your evenings in a state of passive consumption, absorbing whatever the world offers you without directing your own attention, you will feel a certain way. Not necessarily terrible, but vaguely hollow, vaguely dissatisfied, as though something important is always slightly out of reach. If you spend even a portion of those same evenings in genuine engagement, reading something that interests you, thinking about something that matters to you, pursuing something you care about, you will feel different. Not dramatically different, necessarily, not transformed overnight, but genuinely different. More like yourself, more like someone who is living rather than just existing. This sounds like obvious advice, and in some ways it is. But the reason most people do not act on it is not that they do not understand it. The reason is that the pull of passive consumption is very strong, especially at the end of a tiring day, and the rewards of genuine engagement are not immediate in the way that passive consumption is immediately rewarding. The television is right there. The comfortable nothing of a screen is immediately available. The book that might challenge you, the sketch pad, the instrument, the journal, these require an initial act of will that passive consumption does not require. And Bennett's argument was simply that this initial act of will, small as it is worth making. Not every night, not with the guilt and self-punishment of someone who has failed a diet, but regularly, as a practice, as a choice made on behalf of your future self and the quality of the life that future self will inhabit. There is something important here about the long view. Bennett was, in many ways, a writer preoccupied with the long view. He was not very interested in quick fixes or immediate transformations. He thought that real change happened slowly, through the patient accumulation of small daily choices, each of which seemed insignificant in isolation, but which compounded over months and years into something genuinely transformative. This is a view that is both deeply reassuring and deeply demanding. Reassuring because it means that you do not have to be perfect, you do not have to revolutionize your life tomorrow, you just have to make slightly better choices today than you made yesterday, and then do it again the next day, and the day after that. Demanding because it requires patience, and patience is not something that comes naturally to most people, especially in a culture that is obsessed with speed and immediate results. But the compound interest of good habits is real. A person who reads for 30 minutes a day will have read something like 50 books a year. In 5 years, 250 books. The difference between the person who has read 250 serious books and the one who has read none is not just a matter of information or facts. It is a difference in the quality and richness of their thinking, in their capacity to understand the world and themselves, in the resources they have available to bring to the problems and pleasures of their own lives. This is not an argument for reading as opposed to other forms of development. It is an illustration of a principle that applies everywhere. Small, consistent efforts made in the direction of genuine growth produce results that are completely disproportionate to the apparent size of any individual effort. The magic is in the consistency, not in the grand gesture. Bennett was also honest about failure. He knew that people would start with great intentions and then lose their way. He knew that the enthusiasm of a resolution rarely survived the ordinary friction of daily life undiminished. He did not think this meant the project was hopeless. He thought it meant that the project required not just inspiration, but a kind of rugged practicality. Not the rugged practicality of grinding through misery, but the rugged practicality of a craftsman who knows that the work has good days and bad days, and that the bad days do not mean the project is wrong, they just mean today was a bad day, and tomorrow is another chance to try again. He was particularly wise about guilt, which he thought was one of the most counterproductive emotions available to human beings. Not guilt as a moral compass, not the healthy recognition that you have done something wrong and should try to do better. He valued that kind of accountability. But the corrosive, paralyzing guilt of someone who has fallen short of their own standards and cannot stop punishing themselves for it. The person who misses their reading habit for 3 days and spends the next week feeling so bad about the 3 days they missed that they cannot bring themselves to pick up a book at all. This kind of guilt is not useful. It does not help you do better. It just adds suffering to failure when what you actually need is simply to try again. Pick up the book, start the hour, return to the practice, not with a fanfare of renewed resolution and self-improvement talk, but quietly, practically, the way you would return to any habit after an interruption. Without drama, without self-punishment. Just here we are again. Let us continue. There is something in this, in Bennett's attitude toward failure and recovery, that is genuinely compassionate without being soft. He held high standards for himself and for his readers. He believed people were capable of much more than they usually demanded of themselves, but he did not translate high standards into a punishing relationship with imperfection. He understood that the project of living better was a lifelong project, that it proceeded in fits and starts, that discouragement was a normal part of the experience and not a sign that you were doing it wrong. The people who eventually succeed at living well, and Bennett believed success was genuinely available, are not the ones who never stumble. They are the ones who stumble, get up, and keep going, without making the stumbling into a bigger drama than it actually is. Let us spend some time with what Bennett said about other people, because the way we relate to other people is, he believed, one of the most important dimensions of a well-lived life, and also one of the most neglected in any serious discussion of how to live. We talk about habits and productivity and personal development, and we sometimes forget that human beings are fundamentally, irreducibly social animals, and that the quality of our relationships is not separate from the quality of our lives. It is one of the primary things that makes or breaks it. Bennett had an interesting and quite radical view of other people. He thought most of us were far too quick to judge, not in the obvious, dramatic sense of harsh moral condemnation, but in the subtler, more pervasive sense of seeing people in terms of the roles they played rather than the full human beings they actually were. The waiter is just the waiter. The colleague is just the colleague. The person on the train who seems boring or strange or uninteresting is just another background character in the story of your life. Bennett thought this was both an ethical failure and a practical one. An ethical failure because every one of these people was living a life as complex and rich and painful and beautiful as your own, and deserved to be seen as such. A practical failure because the habit of seeing people superficially impoverished your own inner life. It kept you from the genuine pleasure and meaning that real encounter with another human being, not a role, not a type, but an actual person, could provide. He was a great observer of people, not in the cold, detached sense of someone collecting specimens, but in the warm, curious sense of someone who genuinely found other people interesting. He believed that almost every person, if you paid close enough attention, revealed something worth knowing, some texture, some quality, some story that you had not anticipated. He had cultivated this habit of attention, this genuine curiosity about the human beings around him, and it had enriched his life in ways that he could not easily quantify, but would not have traded for anything. He thought about sympathy a great deal. Not sympathy as a performance, not the socially required expression of concern when someone you know is going through difficulty, but sympathy as a genuine imaginative act, the effort to actually understand what it is like to be someone other than yourself. He thought this capacity, which he also called imagination in the human sense, was one of the most important things a person could develop, not just because it made you a better friend or colleague or family member, though it did all of those things, but because it expanded your world. Every person you genuinely understood added to your understanding of what it meant to be human. Every life you genuinely imagined, even partially, even imperfectly, widened the circle of what was comprehensible and meaningful to you. You became, in a very real sense, larger, more capable of understanding yourself in relation to others, more capable of finding meaning in experiences that a narrower person would have passed through without registering. This is what he meant when he talked about literature in connection with human relationships. A great novel is not, at its core, an entertainment, though it may be that too. It is an act of imaginative encounter with other lives. It puts you inside experiences you have never had, inside minds you could not otherwise access, inside historical moments and geographical places and social conditions that your own limited biography could never take you to. And the person who has done this regularly, who has genuinely inhabited other lives through the act of reading, is a person with a richer, more flexible, more empathetic understanding of what it means to be human. They have more to bring to their actual relationships, more capacity for the kind of genuine imaginative sympathy that makes real connection possible. Bennett wrote about marriage and family with the same honest directness he brought to everything else. He did not sentimentalize these relationships or pretend they were naturally easy. He knew they were hard. He knew that the people closest to us were also the ones most likely to see us at our worst, to bear the brunt of our worst moods and failures, to become, over time, so familiar that we stopped actually seeing them. He thought this familiarity, the way it could erode the sense of wonder and genuine attention that good relationships require, was one of the great dangers of domestic life. Not catastrophic danger, not the danger of dramatic failure, but the quieter danger of a life lived side by side without genuine contact. Two people sharing a house and a bed and a future, but not really meeting each other, not really seeing each other, not really being present to each other in the way that transforms mere cohabitation into genuine companionship. His prescription, such as it was the same prescription he applied to everything else: attention. The deliberate, conscious effort to see the person you love as they actually are, not as the convenient mental shorthand you have developed for them over years of familiarity. The effort to actually listen when they speak. The effort to stay curious about them, to remember that they are a person with an inner life as complex as your own, who is also trying to figure out how to live, who is also struggling and hoping, and sometimes failing and sometimes surprising even themselves. This effort, small and daily and largely invisible, was what kept relationships alive. Not grand gestures, not periodic, dramatic renewals of feeling, but the patient, daily practice of genuine attention to the person sharing your life. This is something that resonates very deeply if you have ever been in a long relationship and noticed the moment when you stopped really seeing each other. When conversations became logistical rather than genuine. When you started finishing each other's sentences, not from intimacy but from habit. When the person you love most in the world became, somehow, the person you actually paid least attention to because you had decided, without consciously deciding it, that you already knew everything worth knowing about them. Bennett would have found this both understandable and sad. Understandable because he had enormous compassion for the ways that ordinary life wore down even the best intentions. Sad because the person right there, the person you could reach out and touch, was always more interesting than the mental model you had substituted for them. Always more surprising. Always still worth the effort of genuine attention. Let us turn to something that might seem like a departure but is actually central to everything Bennett was trying to say. The question of money. Not money as a moral subject, not the question of whether it is good or bad to want it, but the practical question of its relationship to the life you are trying to live. Bennett was not a romantic about money. He had grown up without it, and he knew what its absence felt like. He did not pretend that poverty was ennobling or that financial anxiety was a condition in which genuine self-development easily flourished. He was too honest for that. He knew that a certain basic material security made everything else easier. that a mind constantly preoccupied with survival had less room for the kinds of development he was advocating. But he also saw, very clearly, that the relationship between money and happiness was not nearly as direct as most people assumed. He had known very rich people whose inner lives were impoverished in almost every way that mattered. He had known people of modest means who were, by any honest assessment, living better than the rich people around them, not despite their modest means, necessarily, but in a way that had no strong correlation with their means at all. What mattered, he thought, was not how much you had, but what you did with what you had, and more importantly, what you did with yourself, with your time and your attention and your inner life, regardless of how much you had. He was particularly critical of what he called the worship of money in the abstract, the way that people made the accumulation of wealth a goal in itself, rather than a means to other goals. He thought this was both practically mistaken and spiritually deadening. Practically mistaken because money in the abstract provided no reliable satisfaction. The person who wants more money always discovers, on getting it, that they still want more, because the wanting was never really about the money in the first place. Spiritually deadening because the person who has made accumulation their primary goal has, by definition, sacrificed everything that might have given their days genuine meaning on the altar of a number in an account. He was also, it should be said, equally critical of the opposite error, the romantic rejection of material concern, the attitude that caring about money at all was somehow base or unworthy. He was too pragmatic for that. He thought that managing your material circumstances well, not obsessively, not at the expense of everything else, but thoughtfully and realistically, was part of the responsibility of being an adult who wanted to live well. He thought that financial chaos, like any other form of external disorder, consumed mental energy that could have been used for more important things. He believed in order, not rigidity, but a basic organization of one's material affairs that freed the mind from constant low-level anxiety about whether the bills were going to be paid. And here is where he connected money to time in a way that was quite original for his period. He pointed out that most people, in their relationship to money, were concerned exclusively with earning more of it rather than with spending less of it. They worked more hours to earn more, often sacrificing the very time that they most needed for the development of their inner lives. And they did this without ever seriously asking whether there was another option, whether, if they spent less, they might work less, and whether the hours they reclaimed might be worth more to them than the money they would have earned in those hours. He was not preaching asceticism. He was not suggesting people impoverish themselves for the sake of leisure. He was asking a question that most people never asked: what would I actually trade, in terms of money and the work that earns it, for more time? How much of my life am I exchanging for income, and is that exchange the one I would make if I thought about it clearly? This question feels, if anything, more urgently relevant now than it did in Bennett's time. We live in a world where the pressure to earn, to acquire, to accumulate is more intense and more pervasive than perhaps at any previous point in history. The marketing complex that surrounds us is specifically designed to manufacture desire, to make us want things we did not know we wanted, to keep us perpetually in a state of aspiration towards some slightly more expensive version of the life we currently have. Against this pressure, the simple question Bennett was asking, is this exchange worth it, is almost revolutionary, not because the answer is always no, not because ambition and the desire for material comfort are bad things, but because the question, when genuinely asked, opens up the possibility that the answer might sometimes be different from what you assumed, that the exchange might not always be worth it, that some of what you are trading is not worth what you are getting for it. There is a particular passage in How to Live that I want to dwell on for a moment, because it captures something essential about Bennett's worldview. He talks about what he calls the daily miracle, the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible fact that you are alive, that you are conscious, that you are experiencing the world, that you have, in each waking moment, access to the full apparatus of human sensation and thought and feeling, he pointed out that this was extraordinary in a way that familiarity had made invisible, that the sheer fact of being alive, of being a person with an inner life, was something so remarkable that it ought to produce in us, regularly, a state of something like awe. Not religious awe, necessarily, though religious sensibility might be one path to it. Simply the recognition, available to any reflective person, that existence is strange and beautiful and fleeting, and that the ordinary days we so often wish were already over are actually the substance of the life we have been given. This is not cheap positivity. Bennett was not telling people to be relentlessly upbeat or to pretend that difficulty and suffering did not exist. He had experienced enough of both to know that pretending was not only dishonest but counterproductive. What he was pointing at was something deeper than positive thinking. He was pointing at gratitude in the philosophical sense, the recognition of what you actually have, as distinct from what you wish you had or fear you might lose. And he thought that this recognition, cultivated deliberately, was one of the most practical things a person could do for the quality of their daily experience. There is a story, not from Bennett's book, but from the kind of experience his book tends to produce in people, of a retired schoolteacher in his mid-60s who had read How to Live on the recommendation of a former student. He had been in a state of low-grade depression since his retirement, partly from the loss of purpose that often accompanies the end of a long career, and partly from the accumulation of regrets, things he had wanted to do and had not done, the creative life he had always told himself he would pursue when he had time, the relationships he had let drift. He read the book in a week, and then he sat down and wrote a list of everything he still wanted to do, not a bucket list in the cliched sense, not impossible adventures and exotic locations, but real things that were genuinely within his reach. He wanted to learn to paint, which he had never tried. He wanted to read Tolstoy, which he had always meant to do. He wanted to have real conversations with his grandchildren, not just play a role but actually talk with them as the interesting people they were becoming. He wanted to walk more, to notice the city he had lived in for 40 years with fresh eyes. He started, slowly, imperfectly, with the awkwardness of someone who has been still for too long and is rediscovering how to move. He took a painting class at the local community centre and was terrible at it. He kept going, he read Anna Karenina, and it devastated him in the best possible way. He started asking his granddaughter about her life in real, curious, unhurried ways, and was astonished to discover that she was one of the most interesting people he had ever met. And 2 years later, when he talked about this period in his life, what he said was not that he had achieved great things or transformed himself into someone remarkable. What he said was that he was happy, that he felt alive, that he was glad to be who he was, where he was, in the time he had. This was not a small thing. This was, by any honest measure, exactly what Bennett had been trying to help people find. Now, we should spend some time on something Bennett addressed with particular care, which is the question of habit. Not habits in the modern productivity hack sense, not the optimized routines of high performers, though Bennett would have recognized and respected some of what is described in that literature. He was talking about habits in the deeper, more philosophical sense of Aristotle and other thinkers who had grappled with the same question: how does a person become good, not just occasionally, but reliably, durably, as a matter of character rather than effort? His answer was that character was not something you had, it was something you built. Not in a single act of will, not in a moment of decision, but in the daily practice of small choices, each of which reinforced a way of being in the world. The person who reads consistently becomes a reader, not just someone who has read. The person who practices genuine attention consistently becomes an attentive person, not just someone who paid attention once. The person who chooses, day after day, to spend at least some portion of their time in genuine engagement with things that matter to them becomes, over time, a person of genuine inner life. Not someone who wished they had one, but someone who actually does. This is both empowering and demanding. Empowering because it means your character is not fixed. You are not condemned to be the person you have been. Every day offers the opportunity to practice being the person you want to become. And every day that practice happens, the person you want to become becomes a little more real. Demanding because it means there are no shortcuts. You cannot read a book about developing better habits and thereby have them. You cannot watch a video about the power of attention and thereby have a more attentive mind. You have to actually do the thing, over and over again, with patience and consistency and the willingness to return after failure without making the failure into a bigger story than it needs to be. Bennett was particularly clear about one aspect of habit that people often overlook, which is the importance of beginning. Not the importance of beginning with the right conditions, or the right mood, or the right level of readiness, just beginning. He thought that the waiting for the right moment was one of the most reliable ways to ensure that nothing ever happened. The right moment was almost always now, imperfect and unpromising as now might be. The chapter you read today, however briefly and however distractedly, was better than the chapter you plan to read tomorrow when you would have more time and more energy and more focus. The walk you took today, even though you were tired, was better than the walk you were going to take on the weekend when the weather would be better. Begin. Begin imperfectly. Begin with whatever you have, wherever you are, in whatever state you happen to be in. The beginning is not the important part. The practice that the beginning initiates is the important part. And the practice can only start when you actually start. There is something Bennett said about the relationship between physical well-being and the kind of inner development he was advocating that deserves some attention. He was not a health fanatic in the modern sense, but he was clear-eyed about the connection between how you treat your body and how your mind functions. He thought that people who were chronically tired, chronically overfed, chronically sedentary, were making it harder for themselves to live the kind of rich inner life he was describing, not because physical health was a prerequisite for thinking, but because a body that was neglected became a constant source of low-level difficulty that consumed mental energy better spent elsewhere. He believed in sleep in a way that was quite unusual for someone writing in the tradition of Protestant self-improvement, which tended to treat sleep as something to be minimized in the service of productivity. Bennett thought sleep was one of the most important things a person could get right. Not as much sleep as possible, but the right amount, taken at sensible times, as part of an overall pattern of life that respected the body's natural rhythms. He thought that people who were consistently underslept were operating with one hand tied behind their backs, mentally, less capable of the sustained attention that genuine thinking required, less emotionally resilient, less able to find genuine pleasure in anything. And he was writing this before any of the modern research on sleep had been done. He was writing from observation and common sense and his own experience of what it felt like to be well-rested versus exhausted. He also thought about food, though with less intensity. He was not a dieter or a nutritionist, but he noticed that the way most people ate, quickly, distractedly, without any real attention to the experience of eating, was a symptom of the same general problem he was diagnosing throughout the book. The problem of passing through experience without actually inhabiting it. A meal eaten with genuine attention to the taste, the texture, the experience of satisfying hunger, the pleasure of eating something well prepared, was a genuine pleasure. The same meal eaten while reading emails, or watching a screen, or running through a mental list of everything you needed to do was just fuel. Both got the calories in. Only one gave you anything worth having. He talked about walking. He loved walking. He thought it was one of the most underrated activities available to human beings. not walking as exercise in the counting steps sense, but walking as a form of thinking, as a form of seeing, as a way of moving through the world at a pace that actually allowed you to experience it. He noticed that people who walked regularly, who made walking a genuine part of their lives rather than just a means of getting from one place to another, tended to have a different relationship to their own minds. They thought more clearly, they noticed more, they were more available to the small pleasures that life scattered along the path for anyone who was moving slowly enough to register them. There is something almost meditative about the kind of walking Bennett was describing, though he would not have used that word. The attention brought to the experience of walking, to the quality of the light, to the sounds of the environment, to the physical sensation of movement, to whatever thoughts arise and pass through the mind during the walk, is not so different from what meditators describe as mindfulness. The difference is that for Bennett, it was all entirely practical. You did not need a special posture or a special technique or a special setting. You just needed to actually walk, to actually be there in the walking rather than somewhere else inside your head. All of these threads, attention, habit, reading, relationships, money, sleep, walking, pleasure, are connected in Bennett's vision by a single central idea that runs through the whole book, like a root system running through soil. The idea that your life is yours, that it is happening right now, today, in the hours you are living through, and that the quality of those hours is, to a surprisingly large degree, up to you. Not in the toxic positivity sense that says everything is a choice and suffering is just a failure of attitude. Not in the sense that external circumstances do not matter, because they do, sometimes enormously. But in the sense that within whatever circumstances you find yourself, there is almost always more room for genuine living than most people use. More room for attention, for curiosity, for pleasure, for genuine connection with other human beings, for the kind of engagement with ideas and beauty that makes life feel worth having. This is not an argument for complacency. It is not a reason to stop trying to change the circumstances that genuinely need changing. It is an argument against the deferral of life, the habit of treating your real life as something that will begin when things are better, when conditions are right, when you have more time, more money, more energy, more certainty about the future. Your real life is now. It has always been now, and every hour you spend waiting for it to begin is an hour that has gone quietly without coming back. Bennett made this point in one of the most memorable passages in the book, in which he compared a person's life to a great estate that had been left to them by their ancestors. The estate was already theirs, the land was already there, the house, the gardens, all of it. They did not need to do anything to acquire it. They had simply to wake up to what they already possessed and begin to cultivate it. Most people, he wrote, were living in one small corner of a great estate, in a room they had always lived in, staring at the same walls, not knowing or having forgotten that beyond the door there were gardens they had never walked in, views they had never seen, rooms full of objects whose interest and beauty they had never suspected. And the only thing standing between them and this larger life was the decision to open the door. This image is so lovely and so right that it is worth sitting with for a moment. The estate is your own life. The room you have always lived in is your habitual self, your familiar routines, your established opinions, your comfortable ignorances. The gardens beyond the door are everything that genuine attention, genuine curiosity, genuine engagement with the world and other people and ideas could show you. You do not have to go anywhere. You do not have to earn this. You already own it. You simply have to decide to actually live in it. One of the most interesting parts of How to Live is the section in which Bennett deals with what he calls the evening hours, the time after dinner and before sleep, that most people in his era spent in ways that he considered largely wasteful. He was fascinated by how people used these hours, and deeply dissatisfied with the answer in most cases. People visited, gossiped, played card games, read trivial novels, sat in front of the fire in a state of comfortable vacancy. He was not opposed to any of these things in moderation. He liked a good conversation and a good fire as much as anyone, but he thought that a life in which every single evening was spent in this way was a life in which an enormous opportunity was being consistently passed by. He suggested something quite specific and quite modest. He suggested that a person take 1 or 2 evenings a week, not 7, not even 5, just 1 or 2, and dedicate them with real intention to something genuinely developmental. Reading a serious book, writing, studying something, practicing a skill, having a genuine conversation rather than a sociable one, not as a performance of self-improvement, not to have something to say about it, but genuinely, privately, for the sake of what it did to the quality of your inner life. He thought that even this modest investment, 1 or 2 genuinely engaged evenings in a week, would, over the course of a year, produce a difference in a person's inner richness and general sense of being alive that they would find difficult to fully explain but impossible to deny. He was right, of course. He was right in the way that is very frustrating to read if you have been failing to do this, because the simplicity of the suggestion is almost mocking. 1 or 2 evenings, not a complete overhaul of your life, not a monastic commitment to self-improvement, just 1 or 2 evenings, used with some degree of intention rather than simply surrendered to the default of easiest available option. The question is not whether this would make a difference. It clearly would. The question is why so few people actually do it. And the answer, as far as Bennett was concerned, was simply that most people had never really decided to. They had thought about it. They had intended to, but they had not made the actual concrete decision and then followed through on it with any consistency. This brings us back to one of the most important themes in the book, which is the distinction between wishing and deciding. Most people wish their lives were different in various ways. They wish they read more, thought more, had deeper relationships, felt more alive, wasted less time. Wishing is comfortable and effortless and produces no results whatsoever. Deciding is different. Deciding involves an actual commitment, a real choice, a genuine act of will that changes how you behave. Not forever, necessarily. Not grandly. But today, this week, in this specific, concrete, actual situation, deciding what you are going to do with the next hour and then doing it. Bennett had enormous respect for the act of decision. He thought it was one of the most characteristically human capacities, the ability to choose, against the grain of habit and inertia, to do something different from what you would have done by default. He thought most people exercised this capacity far less than they were capable of, not because they lacked the will, but because they had never quite understood that this was what living well required. Not grand acts of will, not heroic overcomings of terrible adversity, just the daily, ordinary, largely invisible act of deciding in small ways to be the person you want to be rather than the person inertia is always trying to make you. And what is the person you want to be? This is a question Bennett thought everyone should spend serious time with. Not the socially acceptable answer, not the answer that would make your parents proud or your peers envious, but the honest answer, the answer that emerges from genuine self-knowledge and genuine engagement with your own values, rather than from the expectations and pressures of the world around you. He thought that most people had never really asked themselves this question seriously, and that this lack of self-knowledge was one of the primary sources of the vague dissatisfaction that characterized so many apparently successful lives. You can be living a life that by every external measure is a good life, good job, good income, good family, good reputation, and still feel that something essential is missing. And often the thing that is missing is precisely this, the sense that the life you are living is genuinely yours, that it reflects your actual values and actual desires and actual nature, rather than the values and desires and nature that were assigned to you by your background, your upbringing, your culture, the expectations of the people around you. Bennett thought that discovering what you actually wanted, not what you were supposed to want, but what you actually wanted, in the private, honest, unperformed space of your own reflective consciousness, was one of the most important things a person could do. And he thought that living in accordance with what you actually wanted was the only reliable path to genuine happiness, as opposed to the performance of happiness that most people settled for. This is connected to something he said about courage, not physical courage, not the dramatic courage of battlefields and emergencies, but the quiet, daily, often invisible courage of living according to your own values rather than somebody else's. The courage to read the book you actually want to read rather than the book that everyone is reading. The courage to pursue the interest that genuinely excites you rather than the one that would impress people at a party. The courage to have the real conversation rather than the comfortable one. The courage to sit with your own discomfort rather than drowning it in distraction. The courage, ultimately, to take your own inner life seriously in a culture that is constantly suggesting that what happens on the inside matters less than what shows on the outside. Bennett thought this kind of courage was within everyone's reach. It did not require extraordinary strength or exceptional character. It required only the decision to actually pay attention to your own experience, to take seriously what you found there, and to act on it. Not always. Not in every situation, not with no regard for the needs and feelings of others. He was not advocating selfishness or solipsism, but with enough regularity and enough sincerity that the life you lived gradually came to feel genuinely yours, rather than a performance of a life designed by committee. We are near the end of our time together with this remarkable book, and I want to draw together some of the threads that have been running through everything we have discussed, because there is a coherence to Bennett's vision that is easy to miss when you are reading him section by section, but that becomes very clear when you step back and look at the whole. What he is describing throughout this book is a particular kind of relationship between a person and their own life, a relationship characterized by attention rather than inertia, by choice rather than default, by genuine engagement rather than passive consumption, by curiosity rather than complacency, by the willingness to actually inhabit the hours you are living through, rather than mentally relocating yourself to some better time that has not arrived yet and may never come. He is not describing a perfect life. He is not describing a life without difficulty or failure or loss. He knows perfectly well that life contains all of these things in abundance, and he is not interested in pretending otherwise. What he is describing is a quality of presence to your own experience that makes all of the things that life contains, the good and the bad, the easy and the difficult, the delightful and the painful, genuinely, fully, richly yours, so that when you look back, from wherever you eventually look back from, you can say with some honesty that you were actually there, that you saw it, that you felt it, that you were not asleep while your life went by. This is the deepest thing Arnold Bennett was trying to say, and it is a thing that does not age, that does not become irrelevant, that does not require updating for the latest technology or the newest cultural context. The fundamental situation of a human being, alive, conscious, possessed of time that is steadily running out, with the capacity for attention and choice and genuine engagement with the world, is the same situation it has always been. And the challenge that Bennett identified of actually meeting that situation with honesty and intention, rather than drifting through it in a fog of habit and distraction, is the same challenge it has always been. The good news, and there is very good news in this book, is that the threshold for beginning is remarkably low. You do not need to be a certain kind of person. You do not need to have a certain kind of life, or a certain amount of money, or a certain level of education, or a certain quality of circumstances. You need to decide to start paying attention to the hours you have, to the person you are, to the people around you, to the extraordinary fact that you are alive right now in a world full of things worth noticing. That is all. That is everything, and it is entirely, completely, already within your reach. There is a final story worth telling here, because it is in many ways the story of the book itself. Arnold Bennett was not born knowing how to live. He grew up in a household in the English Midlands, in a modest town, in modest circumstances, with a father who was ambitious for him, but whose own life had been constrained by the pressures of survival. He could have lived a small life. He had every reason, by the logic of his circumstances, to stay in the room he had been given and look at its walls. Instead, he opened the door. He read. He wrote. He taught himself French and travelled to Paris and spent years among the artists and writers and thinkers of his era. He developed, through patient and determined effort over many years, a mind and a sensibility that made him one of the most interesting and fully realised people of his generation. And then, generously, because he understood what it was to start with, less than you needed, he wrote this book. He wrote it for the person who had not been born into advantage, for the person whose daily life did not naturally or automatically provide what he was describing, for the person who had to work to find the room, to carve out the time, to fight against inertia and exhaustion and the endless demands of an ordinary working life. He wrote it as a peer, not as an authority, as someone who had struggled with the same problems and had found, imperfectly and slowly and with many false starts and failures, some ways through. He wrote it with affection for the ordinary human being trying to do their best in circumstances that were not always cooperative, and he wrote it with a kind of stubbornness on that person's behalf. A refusal to accept that the life available to that person was necessarily a small or hollow one. A conviction that genuine living, rich, attentive, curious, full, was not the exclusive property of any particular class or level of education or type of circumstance. It was available. It was available now. It was available to you. That conviction, expressed in Bennett's clear and warm and sometimes gently exasperated prose, is what has kept this book alive and relevant for more than 100 years. Not a formula, not a system, not a set of habits to be mechanically applied, just a clear-eyed, warm-hearted, enormously human invitation to take your own life seriously. To show up for it, to stop waiting for it to be different from what it is, and start engaging with it as it actually is. To look around at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, or the unremarkable Thursday morning, and recognize it for what it actually is, which is not a waste of time or a delay between important things, but your actual life, happening right now, in this moment, in all its ordinariness and imperfection and irreplaceable richness. And if you hear that invitation, and you feel something respond in you, some recognition, some small flame of something that wants to be more alive, then do not wait. Not tomorrow, not when things are better, not when you have more time or more energy or more certainty. Open the door to the rest of the estate. Take the first step into the garden you have been meaning to explore. Read the first page of the book that has been waiting on your nightstand. Have the real conversation instead of the comfortable one. Go for the walk. Notice the tree. Pay attention to the person across from you as though they were genuinely interesting, because they are. Write the first line of whatever you have been meaning to write. Play the first chord of whatever you have been meaning to play. Begin, imperfectly, awkwardly, without any guarantees about where it will lead. Begin. Because the extraordinary thing, the thing that Arnold Bennett spent this whole beautiful book trying to tell you, is that the beginning is enough. The decision to begin is itself a form of living, And from there, one small attentive step at a time, a whole life can open up. A life that is genuinely, recognisably, irreducibly yours. But before we arrive at that conclusion, let us spend time with several more dimensions of Bennett's thinking that we have not yet fully explored, because this book is richer and stranger and more layered than a quick summary can suggest, and every layer deserves its proper attention. There is a section of the book where Bennett writes about what he calls the art of living in the present, not the present as a spiritual concept, not the mindfulness of modern therapeutic culture, not the Zen-inflected wisdom that has become so familiar in our time, though he would have recognized the truth in all of those things. He meant something very concrete and very practical. He meant the habit of being in the situation you are actually in, rather than the situation you wish you were in, or the situation you are afraid of, or the situation that exists in the version of events you are perpetually constructing in your head. He had a vivid way of describing this. He said that most people spent their present moments living in either the past or the future. The past, through regret, the endless rehearsal of things that went wrong, mistakes that were made, opportunities that were missed, moments where a different choice might have led somewhere better. The future, through anxiety, the rehearsal of things that might go wrong, of dangers that might materialize, of failures that might happen, of the 1,000 ways that circumstances could conspire against you. And the present, the actual moment of actual experience, was left largely unoccupied. People pass through their present moments like ghosts, neither fully there nor fully anywhere, haunted by a past that could not be changed and frightened by a future that had not yet arrived. He was not suggesting that the past was unimportant or that you should never think about the future. He was too practical for that. He understood the value of reflection on the past, the genuine learning that is possible from honest examination of what has happened and why. He understood the necessity of planning for the future, the basic wisdom of thinking ahead and making provision for what was coming. What he was opposed to was the pathological version of both, the rumination that served no purpose except to inflict pain, and the anxiety that consumed enormous amounts of mental energy while contributing precisely nothing to any practical situation. Both of these were forms of absence from the life you were actually living. Both of them stole the present in the name of something that was not worth the price. His prescription was, as always, very practical. When you notice yourself rehearsing the past in a way that is not producing any useful insight, just notice it. Not with judgment, not with self-criticism, not with the added layer of feeling bad about feeling bad. Just notice it, and then gently, firmly, redirect your attention to whatever is actually in front of you. The meal you are eating, the person you are talking to, the view from the window, the book in your hands. Whatever is actually here, actually now, actually available for your genuine engagement. This is not suppression. It is not the avoidance of difficult feelings. It is simply the choice to live where your life is actually happening rather than where it happened or where it might happen someday. He made a distinction that is still rarely made between thinking and worrying. He thought of these as almost completely different activities that people constantly confused. Thinking was productive, constructive, moving from a problem toward a solution or an understanding. Worrying was repetitive, circular, returning to the same feared outcome again and again without ever progressing toward anything useful. Thinking ended somewhere. Worrying could go on forever without arriving anywhere at all. And the tragedy was that people often felt, while worrying, that they were doing something valuable, that the sheer intensity of their anxiety was somehow proportionate to the seriousness of the problem they were worried about, and that to stop worrying would be irresponsible, would be to fail to take the problem seriously enough. Bennett thought this was one of the most pernicious of mental habits. He thought that most of the worrying people did was not only useless, but actively counterproductive, that it consumed the mental energy that could have been used to actually address whatever was worrying them, or failing that, to accept what could not be addressed and get on with living. He was not telling people to be blithe or reckless. He was telling them to be more honest about what worry actually accomplished, and to reserve their mental energy for the kind of genuine thinking that might actually help. To worry less and think more, to rehearse fewer disasters in their imagination, and engage more fully with the actual situation in front of them. He connected this to health. He believed, and again this was well before modern psychosomatic medicine had articulated the same connection, that the state of the mind had a profound effect on the state of the body. That people who were chronically anxious paid a physical price for it, that the body's response to prolonged mental distress was not neutral, that it was wearing and depleting in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. And conversely, that people who had developed a measure of genuine equanimity, not the forced cheerfulness of someone performing happiness, but the real, earned quietness of a mind that had learned to live in the present without constant disturbance, tended to be physically more vigorous, more resilient, more capable of the sustained effort that good living required. He thought about equanimity a great deal, and he was careful to distinguish it from indifference. Equanimity was not the absence of feeling, it was not the refusal to be moved by things. It was something closer to what the Stoics had called the discipline of desire, the practice of wanting what you have rather than what you do not have, of being genuinely at ease in the situation you are actually in, rather than pining for some other situation. He had enormous admiration for people who had developed this quality, not through the suppression of feeling, but through a genuine reckoning with the nature of things, with the fact that life was uncertain, that outcomes were rarely fully within anyone's control, that the things you could control were your own attention and your own choices and your own responses to what happened to you, and that these were enough. These were, in fact, everything. This is connected to something else Bennett was remarkable on, which is the question of acceptance. Not passive acceptance, not the resignation of someone who has given up trying to change things that might be changed, but the active, clear-eyed acceptance of things that cannot be changed, combined with the equally clear-eyed identification of things that can. He thought that most people spent a great deal of energy either raging against things they could not change or passively enduring things that they actually could. The person who fumes about the weather, who takes the traffic personally, who cannot release themselves from the grip of circumstances that have not gone the way they wanted, this person is suffering unnecessarily, and they are suffering in a way that makes everything else harder. The person who accepts what is beyond their control without bitterness or resentment, this person has freed an enormous amount of mental and emotional energy for the things that are actually worth spending it on. But acceptance, Bennett was very clear, was not the same as acceptance of everything. There were things in his world and in every world that ought not to be accepted. Injustice, cruelty, unnecessary suffering, the structures that kept people small and poor and unheard. He had grown up in one of those structures himself, and he had not accepted it. He had pushed against it with everything he had. The acceptance he was advocating was not of those things, but of the specific things that fell into the category of genuinely beyond your control, the past, the nature of other people, the weather, the inevitable disappointments and losses that come with any life honestly lived. These things, fought against with resentment and bitterness, just made you miserable without changing them. Accepted with clarity and something like grace, they became simply part of the landscape of your life, features of the terrain, not enemies to be vanquished. Now let us talk about something that Bennett addressed obliquely throughout the book, but rarely named directly, which is the question of meaning. What makes a life meaningful? Not in the grand philosophical sense of cosmic purpose or divine intention. He was too honest a writer to pretend to answers he did not have, but in the practical, lived sense, What gives an ordinary day a quality of meaning rather than just a quality of time passing? What makes you feel, at the end of a day, that it was worth having? His answer, drawn from everything else he said in the book, was that meaning came from engagement. From genuine, attentive, caring engagement with whatever you were doing, with whoever you were with whatever you were thinking about or working toward or trying to understand. Meaning was not a thing you found fully formed somewhere and then possessed. It was something that arose in the activity of living when you brought your full self to that activity rather than just going through the motions. A meaningless day was not a day in which nothing important happened. It was a day in which you were not really present, in which you went through the motions without inhabiting them, in which the hours passed without your actually being in them. This means that the most apparently ordinary moments were capable of being meaningful. A conversation with a child about something the child had noticed. The act of making something, a meal, a drawing, a piece of writing, with genuine care and attention. A walk in which you actually saw the world you were walking through. A book read slowly, with genuine engagement. These were not dramatic moments. They were not the moments that would make it into a memoir or a eulogy. They were the substance of life, the texture of the thing, and when they were inhabited fully, they produced a quality of experience that nothing more dramatic could replace. He was also very wise about the difference between meaning and pleasure. These were not the same thing, and confusing them was the source of a great deal of unhappiness. Pleasure was immediate, sensory, requiring relatively little of you, the pleasure of a good meal, of physical comfort, of entertainment that carried you along without demanding anything. Meaning was slower, often requiring effort and sometimes discomfort, and was sustained in ways that pleasure was not. The work you did that actually challenged you was meaningful in a way that easy work was not, even if it was less immediately pleasurable. The relationship that asked something real of you was meaningful in a way that purely pleasant company was not. The book that made you struggle was meaningful in a way that the book that carried you effortlessly along was often not. Bennett thought both were important. He was not a Puritan who thought that pleasure needed to be earned through suffering, and he was not a hedonist who thought that pleasure was the whole point. He thought that a well-lived life contained both, in proportions that respected the full range of human experience rather than obsessively optimizing for one at the expense of the other. And he thought that the capacity for both, for genuine pleasure in good things and genuine meaning in effortful ones, was developed through the same fundamental practice, the practice of genuine attention, genuine presence, genuine engagement with the life you were actually living. Let us also spend a moment with something that the modern world has made more complex, but no less important, which is the question of what we might call mental hygiene, not in the clinical sense, but in the everyday sense of the habits of thought that either help or harm the quality of your inner life. Bennett was a strong believer that what you put into your mind mattered, in the same way that what you put into your body mattered. Not in a rigid or anxious way. He was not prescribing some kind of mental diet of approved thoughts, but in the general sense that the mind was shaped by what it was regularly exposed to and regularly practiced, and that some things shaped it well and some things shaped it poorly. He thought that habitual pessimism was one of the great enemies of a well-lived life, not the honest pessimism of someone who has looked clearly at a bad situation and is being realistic about it. That kind of clear-eyed assessment he respected enormously. But the reflexive, habitual pessimism of someone who had trained themselves, through years of practice, to expect the worst, to see the negative first, to always find the shadow in the sunlight. This was a habit. It had been learned or had developed gradually through accumulated experience, and like any other habit it could, with effort, be unlearned. Not replaced with false positivity, not papered over with forced optimism, but gently, consistently redirected. the way you might redirect a plant that is growing toward darkness by introducing a little more light. He believed in what we might now call cognitive reframing, though he had no such term for it. He believed that the same set of facts could be viewed in more than one way, and that some ways of viewing them were genuinely more accurate than others. Not more comforting, not more pleasant, but more accurate. Because most genuinely bad situations contained within them something that was not bad, some possibility or resource or potential for growth, or even just for simple survival, and seeing this was not self-deception, but more complete perception. The person who could look at a setback and see both the setback and the opportunity was seeing more of the truth than the person who could only see the setback. This was not positive thinking in the shallow sense. It was fuller thinking, more honest thinking, thinking that refused to edit reality down to its most discouraging version. He thought about character not as a fixed property of individuals, but as something that was constantly being made and remade by choices. He had a passage where he talked about how every time you chose the harder thing over the easier thing, not dramatically, not in some great moral test, but in the small daily decisions of ordinary life, you were building something. You were making yourself, in a very literal sense, into a different person. The person who chooses to sit down and read instead of vegetating in front of whatever screen is available is, in that small act, practicing a habit of engagement over passivity that gradually, imperceptibly, reshapes their character. The person who chooses to say something honest rather than something comfortable is practicing a habit of honesty that gradually makes them more honest. The person who chooses to really listen to someone they are with, rather than waiting for their turn to speak, is practicing a habit of genuine attention that gradually makes them a better friend, a better companion, a more fully human presence in the lives of the people around them. These choices are small. They are made dozens of times every day, in circumstances that seem trivial, and yet they are, cumulatively, the most important choices you make, because they are the choices that make you who you are. Not the dramatic choices, not the crossroads moments that you will remember for the rest of your life. Those matter too, of course, but they are rare. The daily choices, the small ones, the ones that seem not to matter, these are the constant river of self-making that runs through every day of your life, and in which, whether you intend it or not, you are constantly being formed. Bennett thought about the self in a way that is quite modern in its implications. He thought that there was not a fixed, essential self that was simply being expressed or suppressed in the choices you made, that the self was, to a large degree, constituted by those choices. You became your habits. You became your patterns of attention. You became the things you regularly practiced. This was both a humbling and an empowering idea. Humbling because it meant you could not simply discover who you were and then live from that discovery. The who you were was always in process, always being made and remade. Empowering because it meant that if you were not happy with who you were, you had more agency to change it than you might think. Not through a dramatic act of self-reinvention, but through the patient, consistent practice of being the person you wanted to become, one small daily choice at a time. He had a lot to say about self-knowledge, which he considered one of the most difficult and most important of all human projects. Not self-knowledge in the sense of a fixed inventory of your traits and tendencies, but self-knowledge as an ongoing, humble, curious inquiry into what you actually think and feel and value and want. He thought most people avoided this inquiry, not because they were afraid of what they would find exactly, but because they were afraid of the discomfort of genuine self-examination, the discomfort of discovering that you believe things you do not want to believe, that you want things you think you should not want, that you have been less honest with yourself than you would like to think. He suggested keeping a journal, not as a repository of events, not the diary that records what happened, but as a space for genuine thinking on paper. The act of writing things down, he believed, had a particular clarity-producing effect on thought that simply thinking in your head did not. When you wrote, you were forced to commit to something. You had to actually say what you meant, rather than hovering in a comfortable haze of impressions and half-formed ideas. The discipline of articulating your thoughts in writing was a form of self-examination that, practiced regularly, produced a quality of self-knowledge that was both more honest and more useful than anything available from mere introspection. He was also, in a way that feels contemporary, interested in the gap between who people thought they were and who they actually were. He noticed that people's self-images were often quite flattering relative to the evidence. They thought of themselves as more patient, more generous, more attentive, more principled than their actual behaviour consistently demonstrated, and he was not interested in puncturing people's self-esteem, not interested in making people feel worse about themselves. He was interested in the practical value of accuracy, in the idea that a person who knew themselves clearly, who saw their actual patterns of behaviour without the distortion of wishful thinking, was in a far better position to actually change those patterns than someone who was still operating from a pleasant fiction. There is also, in Bennett's book, a remarkable passage on what he calls the value of solitude. Not solitude as deprivation, not solitude as the absence of company, but solitude as a positive good, as a condition necessary for certain kinds of thought and certain kinds of self-encounter that simply cannot happen in the presence of others. He thought that most people were uncomfortable with solitude in a way that said something important about their relationship with themselves. People who could not stand to be alone, who needed the constant stimulation of company or entertainment or distraction, were often people who were, on some level, avoiding themselves, who found their own company uncongenial, their own thoughts uncomfortable, their own inner life a place they would rather not visit. He was compassionate about this. He understood why it happened. The inner life, unexamined and undeveloped, could be a fairly bleak landscape, full of anxieties and regrets and unresolved tensions that it was genuinely unpleasant to sit with. And the solution, he thought, was not to become better at avoidance, but to begin the work of making the inner life a place worth visiting, to develop, through the practices he had been describing throughout the book, reading, thinking, attention, genuine engagement with the world, an interior landscape that was rich enough and interesting enough to make solitude a pleasure rather than an ordeal. The person who had genuine intellectual interests, who had been cultivating their mind and their sensibilities over time, who had genuine things to think about and genuine pleasures to find in thought, this person found solitude restoring in a way that the person without these resources could not. He talked about what he called the time before sleep as one of the most important periods of the day, the period between lying down and actually falling asleep, which most people filled with worry or meaningless mental activity. He thought this was a waste of a remarkable opportunity. In those quiet minutes, the mind was relaxed and receptive in a way that it was not during the busy, distracted hours of the day. It was a natural time for genuine thinking, for working through problems or ideas in a quieter and less pressured way, for the kind of relaxed reflection that could produce insights unavailable during more pressured thinking. He suggested that people develop the habit of choosing something to think about during these pre-sleep minutes, not something anxious or unresolvable, but something genuinely interesting, some idea or question or problem worth turning over slowly in the mind as the body settled into rest. He also thought about what he called mental freshness, the quality of a mind that was not permanently exhausted, that had reserves of attention and enthusiasm and genuine curiosity that it could bring to new experiences. He thought that mental freshness was not just a product of rest, though rest was part of it. It was also a product of variety, of regularly encountering things that were new, that did not fit the established grooves of habit and routine, that required something fresh and exploratory from the mind. This was why reading widely, pursuing new interests, seeking out new kinds of conversation and experience, was not just a pleasant indulgence, but a form of mental hygiene. It kept the mind alive in ways that routine, however comfortable, could not. It prevented the gradual hardening of perspective that happened to people who stopped encountering genuinely new things, the increasing difficulty of being surprised, the growing tendency to fit everything into established categories, the subtle shrinking of the world that came from engaging only with the familiar. He had something to say about age that is worth dwelling on, because it is unusual and quietly subversive of many cultural assumptions. He did not believe that the capacity for genuine living diminished with age. He thought, in fact, that in some ways it increased, that the person who had been seriously developing their inner life for 20 or 30 or 40 years had resources available that a younger person did not, regardless of the physical changes that came with aging. He had known people in their 60s and 70s who were more genuinely alive, more curious, more capable of real pleasure and real engagement than many people half their age, because they had been at the project of living well for longer, and the accumulation showed. And he had known young people who were already, in some important sense, old, already narrowed by habit and incuriosity, already fixed in patterns that left no room for genuine growth or genuine surprise. He thought the culture's obsession with youth as the peak of human experience was both empirically questionable and practically damaging. It encouraged young people to feel they were at their most alive precisely when they had the least inner resources to bring to the experience of being alive. And it encouraged older people to feel that their best years were behind them, precisely when they had accumulated the experience and the wisdom and the inner richness that made genuine living most possible. He thought both were wrong, and he thought the correction was not a matter of pretending that time did not pass or that aging had no costs, but of understanding what genuine living actually required, which was not youth, but attention, and not physical vitality, but genuine curiosity, and recognizing that these were available across the whole span of a human life. There is one more thing I want to spend time on before we bring this long exploration to its conclusion, and that is something Bennett said about failure. Real failure, not the small stumbles of daily habit, not the missed reading evenings or the weeks when you did not manage to get out for a walk. Real failure. The failure of important things. The job that did not work out, the relationship that ended badly, the creative project that came to nothing, the ambition that was not realized, the hope that was disappointed. These failures, he said, were a part of any life honestly lived, and the question was not whether you would experience them, you would, but what you would do with them when they came. He thought there were two broad categories of response to failure, both of which were common, and both of which were, in their different ways, unhelpful. The first was to treat failure as a verdict, to take the failure of something you tried as evidence that you were the kind of person who failed at things, and to use it to justify giving up more broadly. The second was to refuse to really learn from failure, to dismiss it as bad luck or someone else's fault, and to move on without extracting any real understanding from the experience. Both responses wasted the failure. Both took what was genuinely valuable, which was the information the failure contained, the understanding of what had not worked and why, and threw it away, either in a flood of self-recrimination or in a refusal to honestly examine what had happened. The response he advocated was harder than either of these, because it required both honesty and resilience simultaneously. Honesty about what had actually happened, about what your role in the failure was, about what you could have done differently and why you did not. And resilience in the face of that honesty, the ability to acknowledge the failure clearly without it becoming the story of your life, without it collapsing into the kind of self-definition that made every subsequent effort feel pre-defeated. He thought that the person who could do both of these things, who could be genuinely honest about a failure and genuinely undestroyed by it, was a person who had an enormous advantage in the long project of living well, because they could learn from everything, even the things that hurt, even the things that, for a period, seemed impossible to recover from. They could take the information and use it, and then get up and try again, not despite having failed, but because of what the failure had taught them. He returned, near the end of this book, to the image he had used at the beginning, the 24 hours. He returned to it with a different quality, a fullness that the opening statement did not quite have, because now you understood what he meant by those 24 hours. He did not mean them as an accounting problem, as a resource management challenge, as units of time to be allocated and optimized. He meant them as your life, as the actual substance of the actual days you were actually alive. He meant them as the most intimate thing you possessed, the thing that was yours in a way that nothing else could quite be, because it was made of your own consciousness and your own attention and your own choices, moment by moment, through every hour of every day that you had been given. And his final word, as near as I can represent it, was this: treat those hours with something like reverence, not because they are running out, though they are, and not because there will be a reckoning, though there may be. Treat them with reverence because they are extraordinary, because the fact that they exist, that you exist, that you are here, conscious and alive and capable of attention and thought and love and genuine engagement with the world, is extraordinary in a way that familiarity has made it very easy to forget. Wake up to it, not once in some dramatic moment of epiphany, but daily, in the quiet, ordinary moments of ordinary life. Wake up to the fact that you are alive, that this is your life, that it is happening now. And then, with that awareness alive in you, go and live it, as fully, as attentively, as honestly, as curiously, as generously, and as joyfully as you possibly can. That is what Arnold Bennett was trying to give his readers. Not a technique, not a system, not a set of rules, a perspective, a way of seeing, a wakefulness to the value of the life they already had. And it is, more than a century after he first offered it, still one of the most generous gifts that one person can give to another. The 24 hours are there, every single one of them. They were there this morning when you woke up, and they will be there tomorrow, and they are there now. The question is not whether you have time to live well. The question is whether you will decide that you are worth the effort. And the answer, Arnold Bennett quietly, stubbornly, generously insists, is yes. You are. You always have been. But let us not stop there, because there is something else in this book, something that does not get talked about as often as the famous passages about time and attention, but that runs quietly through everything and gives the whole project its final shape. And that is Bennett's attitude toward other people's judgment, toward the fear of looking foolish, toward the question of what it costs a person, socially and psychologically, to actually begin doing the things they know they should be doing. Because this is the fear that stops most people even before they start. Not laziness, exactly, not ignorance. Fear. The fear of starting to paint at 50 and being terrible at it. The fear of going to a philosophy lecture and understanding nothing. The fear of beginning to read the books that everyone says are important and feeling stupid in the face of them. The fear of pursuing an interest that other people will find pretentious or childish or inexplicably earnest. The fear, underneath all of these, of being seen to care, to genuinely, openly care about something, in a culture that has made a kind of studied indifference into a social virtue. Bennett addressed this with both directness and compassion. He had felt it himself. He knew what it was to begin something in which you were incompetent, to sit in rooms where everyone else seemed to know more than you, to pursue an interest that the people around you did not share or understand. He had done all of this repeatedly throughout his life, and the discomfort had been real. What he had discovered, though, was that the discomfort was temporary and the reward was permanent, that the awkwardness of beginning faded always as you continued, that the people who had seemed intimidatingly knowledgeable were mostly just further along in the same journey you were beginning, and that the alternative, staying safely within the circle of what you already knew, avoiding the risk of looking foolish, never beginning anything that might reveal the size of your ignorance, was a much worse fate than any awkwardness that came with genuine trying. He thought the fear of judgment was one of the most life-limiting of all fears, partly because it was so often entirely mistaken in its object. Most people, most of the time, are far too preoccupied with their own lives and their own fears to spend much time judging yours. The person you are afraid of laughing at your painting, or dismissing your reading choices, or finding your new interest ridiculous, is probably not paying nearly as much attention to you as you fear. And even when they are, even when the judgment is real, even when someone does notice and does find it odd that you are suddenly interested in astronomy or Renaissance history or learning to play the cello in your mid-40s, even then the judgment matters so much less than what you will gain from the pursuit that it is barely worth counting. He urged people to develop what he called a thick skin in matters of self-development, not a thick skin in general, not an indifference to other people's feelings or a callousness about how your actions affected those around you, but a specific thickness of skin around the project of becoming more fully yourself, a capacity to shrug off the amused or puzzled reactions of people who did not understand what you were doing and to keep doing it anyway because you had decided it was worth doing and their confusion was not a reason to stop. He was also wise about the relationship between your development and the people around you. He knew that growth sometimes unsettled relationships, that the person who began to read seriously, who began to think carefully about how to live, who began to develop genuine enthusiasms and genuine opinions, sometimes found that the people they had been close to were uncomfortable with the change. Sometimes people feel left behind by a friend's development. Sometimes people feel implicitly criticized by someone else's choices to do things differently. Bennett was honest about this. He did not pretend it was always easy, that everyone around you would cheer your development on and celebrate the changes in you. Sometimes they would not. Sometimes people would prefer the version of you that they were familiar with, even if that version was less fully alive. His response to this was characteristically balanced. He thought you had responsibilities to the people in your life, real responsibilities, not to be carelessly discarded in the name of self-development. He thought that genuine growth should, in time, make you a better companion, a more interesting friend, a more attentive and generous presence in the lives of those you cared about. If the changes in you were making you colder or more dismissive or less present to the people you loved, something had gone wrong. The project was not to become superior to the people around you, but to become more capable of genuine connection with them, more interesting, more empathetic, more curious, more alive in ways that enriched rather than diminished your relationships. But, and this is important, you could not sacrifice your own development on the altar of other people's comfort. You could not make yourself smaller so that someone else would not feel implicitly compared. You could not stop growing because growth made some people in your life uncomfortable. You had to find the balance between genuine care for others and genuine fidelity to your own becoming. And this balance was not always easy to find, and sometimes required difficult conversations, and sometimes meant that some relationships changed or ended. But the alternative, the permanent suppression of your own growth for the sake of remaining manageable to others, was a form of self-betrayal that Bennett thought was both sad and unnecessary. There is something deeply hopeful in this book that I want to name directly before we conclude, because it is easy to read Bennett as demanding or critical, as someone setting impossibly high standards for what a life should look like. He is not. He is hopeful, genuinely, warmly, persistently hopeful. He believes in people. He believes in the ordinary person's capacity for genuine living in ways that are rare and, once you have felt it, enormously sustaining. He believed this not from sentiment, but from evidence. He had seen it too many times, the transformation that happened in people who simply began to take their own inner lives seriously. The clerk who read Shakespeare and discovered a passion for poetry that enriched every remaining day of his life. The housewife who took a drawing class on a whim and found in it a way of seeing the world that made the world perpetually interesting. The working man who began to take walks on Sunday mornings and discovered that his city was beautiful in ways he had never imagined and that his own capacity for pleasure was far greater than he had known. These were not dramatic stories. They were quiet ones, but they were real, and they were everywhere, in every life that had been even slightly opened by the kind of attention and intention that Bennett was advocating. He believed that human beings were, at their core, creatures who wanted to be alive in this way, that the desire for genuine engagement, for real connection, for the kind of richness that came from an inner life taken seriously, this was not a luxury preference of the culturally sophisticated. It was a basic human need, as universal as the need for food and warmth and belonging, and when it was met, even partially, even imperfectly, the effect on a person's sense of themselves and their sense of the value of being alive was unmistakable. People lit up. People felt, perhaps for the first time in years or in their lives, that they were living rather than just getting through. And this, finally, is what makes Arnold Bennett's book worth reading, worth talking about, worth spending hours exploring together. Not because it has a system, not because it will fix your productivity or optimize your mornings or make you successful by any external measure, but because it speaks to something in you that already knows what he is pointing at. That has always known. That has felt the pull of it in moments of genuine absorption in a book or a conversation or a walk or a piece of music, and that has perhaps forgotten, in the rush and blur of ordinary life, that pull was pointing somewhere important, that it was pointing toward the life you actually want to live. Not someday. Now. The 24 hours are there. Every one of them is yours. What will you do with the next one? If this journey through Bennett's ideas has stirred something in you, if even one thought landed somewhere deep and true, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for this channel. Every subscriber helps us reach more people who are quietly looking for exactly this kind of content, people who want to go deeper, who want more than surface-level advice, who want to sit with the real questions. You are part of building something worth building, and we are grateful for every one of you who chooses to be here. Please also explore the rest of our channel. We have a whole library of deep, careful human explorations of the books that matter most, the ones that do not just entertain, but actually change something in how you see yourself and the world. From philosophy to psychology to literature to the great practical wisdom traditions of every culture and era, there is a vast amount waiting for you. Wander through it. Find the things that call to you. Let them surprise you. That, after all, is exactly what Arnold Bennett would have wanted. He spent his whole life opening doors for people who had forgotten they were allowed to walk through them. Consider this our invitation to you, from him and from us, to keep walking. If this exploration of how to live moved something in you, or made you see your own days just a little differently, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Every like and subscription genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might need to hear exactly this. We are building something here together, a library of ideas that matter, books that have changed how people think and feel and live, explored with the care and depth they deserve. Your support makes it possible to keep going, And please, do take some time to explore the rest of our channel. We have gone deep on many more books like this one, books that ask the difficult and important questions about how human beings can live better, think more clearly, love more genuinely, and find more meaning in the actual texture of ordinary days. There is a whole library waiting for you, just like Bennett's estate. The door is open. Come in.